everybody. My name is Cat Oriel with Forbes Breaking News, and today I'm here with Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Of course. So, we're going to discuss a few polls today coming out of North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. So, a new Emerson College poll shows a tight race, but with Trump slightly ahead of Harris in North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But what do we need to know? Are you seeing momentum shifting in Trump's favor?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say it's shifting in his favor. What I would say is that we've seen some consistent trends here, and we do see that Trump is ahead by one in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, and then ahead by two in North Carolina. Um, I don't think that these are positive trends for Harris. These are certainly competitive states. It's not over yet by any means, but Trump seems to have an upper hand here. Um, she is really going to have to pull it out first in early voting and then hope that the election day turnout is in her favor.
Yeah, let's talk about early voting for a second here. Did your polling tell you anything in terms of voters' intent to vote early versus on election day?
Yes. And so we've got a little bit more data here than we did previously. So in Pennsylvania, for instance, we see very little change at the top of the ticket in the top lines. However, when we look at that early vote, and we've got, I think, around 100 or so folks who say that they voted early out of the full sample. So there's a larger margin of error here, but we see that Harris is ahead by about 68%. Now, that's a significant lead, obviously. However, it's a little bit lower than what we think Biden had in 2020 heading out of early voting. That would have been around the 75% mark. So there's some ground there that she's missing. Now, again, there is a larger margin of error than there is for the poll as a whole. So she is within that margin of error of Biden's vote share. But I wouldn't say that that's a great showing. We're going to need to see that early vote tick up and Democrats turn out more for that early vote if Harris is going to be competitive on election day, because we're likely to see more Republicans vote then. So, looking at North Carolina and Wisconsin, those early voters, North Carolina is split 51-49 among early voters, 51 for Harris, 49 for Trump. That is also not a great showing for Harris there. We can see that a little bit just in the state data where we see the party registration and how that's breaking out. Again, not the best signs for Harris. She wants to run up the score in that early vote, and that doesn't seem to be happening just yet, at least in these three states. Wisconsin, it's a little bit murkier of a picture there. We see that Harris is up in that early vote 60-40, uh, but it's a little bit too early to tell. We have a lower sample size there. Again, these are still warning signs for Harris. The top line numbers aren't good, but when we dive a little bit deeper into that early vote, that's where there's some real red flags.
Are there any other surprising trends or insights from the polls overall that maybe you weren't expecting to see?
I don't know that I'd say totally unexpected. I think maybe we would have expected to see a little bit more of a shift here in terms of the gender divide, perhaps. We've pretty consistently seen that men are breaking for Trump while women are breaking for Harris. That divide isn't quite what Harris would want it to be, though. Trump is winning men more so than she is winning women. So in all three states, Trump wins men by double-digit margins. That's not true for Harris among women, where she's really in that high single digits. So again, there are more women in the electorate in these states. However, as long as those men are voting for Trump and the numbers that they are, then she really has to run up that score among female voters. And right now, we're not seeing that. We're seeing it get close, very competitive, but she really needs to run that up a little bit more, especially heading into in-person election day. She needs to run up that score if she's going to remain competitive here.
In talking about the gender divide, do you feel like you saw any specific factors that might be contributing to this?
N No, not necessarily. That is a trend that we've seen pretty consistently. I think that some factors that might play into the lag among women and her comparative slight weakness to Biden in 2020. We look at the top issues, the economy, to some degree in these states, immigration, but a little bit less so. We see more housing affordability, things like that. But the economy, especially, weighing on the minds of everyone, and that has no gender bias there.
Mhm.
Everyone thinks that it's an issue. Everyone thinks that inflation, especially, is an issue. So, it's likely that folks are tying her to the Biden administration. She is a vice president, so rightfully so. But that could be having an effect on whether or not there is going to be a little bit more of a gender imbalance here. Um, but otherwise, there's very little to point to as far as why she's not getting more sizable margins among women and why she's losing a little bit of ground among men.
Mhm. I saw that the economy, of course, that's a top issue for voters all across the country, but specifically in the poll, you did find that in North Carolina and Wisconsin, that is one of the top issues for voters. So would you say that in all the other polling that you're doing, that is the number one issue that most people are reporting that they're concerned about?
Absolutely. The economy is the top issue. And that's despite positive numbers that we've seen, both in the stock market and in the sort of broader economy, jobs numbers, et cetera. That just isn't necessarily translating to folks back home. We do see in states like Arizona, immigration is the top issue. Obviously, there's been significant numbers of migrants over the past year. We also see that in some of the sort of northeastern states as well, that immigration ticked up as an issue as they've seen some of those migrants uh, come to their states. So the economy is overwhelmingly the top issue, but these other things do matter. You look at housing affordability. I've talked about this before. Harris has done a good job of capitalizing on that housing affordability issue. She's maybe let off the pedal a little bit there, but that's a significant issue, especially to voters under the age of roughly 40, who are maybe in the market to buy a house, can't necessarily afford a house, and are seeing rising rents as well. So, taking these together, it's a big picture, the economy, housing, inflation. There are a lot of factors at play here. We have seen that Trump overwhelmingly wins folks who say that the economy is their top issue. That's narrowed slightly. It's more like a 58-42 spread, roughly. Um, Trump versus Harris winning those voters. And then when you factor in housing affordability, Vice President Harris overwhelmingly wins those folks. So again, it is the top issue. I don't know how much more the campaigns can do at this point to convince folks that the economy is doing well or they're going to do a better job at handling the economy, but time will tell.
Mhm. Going back to the breakdown when it comes to identity, what did you see in terms of the racial breakdowns in support for Trump versus Harris in the swing states, and then maybe also the age division?
Yeah, so that hasn't really changed much throughout the cycle. We've seen that Trump overwhelmingly, not necessarily overwhelmingly, but winning white voters in these swing states, but Harris doing well among African American voters who are especially important in places like North Carolina, um, doing well among Hispanics, not necessarily at the same margins that Biden won these voters in 2020, however, according to exit polling. So she is tracking a little bit behind what Biden was able to do in 2020. That could be a significant factor here, especially depending on turnout. If the white share of the vote in these states is higher than it was in 2020, that's going to be a real problem. And age, we are actually seeing that younger voters are supporting Harris by a little bit higher numbers than we necessarily expected, given Biden's performance in 2020. That's not equal across these states. But we do see that she's doing well among the 18 to 29 demographic. That's roughly a 2-to-1 vote. And President Biden was not able to do quite that in 2020. We see now the 30 to 39 demographic. So now we're talking broadly under 40. That has come back home, so to speak. We're seeing her winning that demographic in these swing states. So I think that the age component, we've seen some noise there. These have been difficult to pin down sort of voters and figure out exactly what's going on with them. They've looked strange, uh, frankly, when Biden was still the nominee. But they've sort of turned around. We're seeing something that's approaching the more, what we'd expect, something more normal. But I think we've got other indicators here. Age is maybe not going to be a determinative factor. It is one, but it's not the factor, I think, in this election in these swing states. We'll see. But yeah, right now, the way it's lined up is about what we would expect.
Now, I do want to talk about the important down ballot races in each of these states. We'll start with North Carolina. How significant do you think it is that 8% of the Trump voters right now plan to support the Democrat, Josh Stein, for the gubernatorial race? And what does that suggest about, party loyalty at large in the state, given Trump's voters' ability to disconnect the down ballot races with the presidency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it does remain to be seen. We have to approach this with a little bit of caution because in 2020, we saw Governor Cooper win re-election fairly easily, while former President Trump won North Carolina by about 2 points. So, I I, I think that it is a potentially good sign for Harris here that Josh Stein has mounted a significant lead over Robinson. I think everyone would agree that there are issues with Robinson's campaign that are sort of outside of you know what we would normally expect, what we would normally control for. So there could be some significant crossing the aisle here by Trump voters to support Stein or perhaps skip the gubernatorial ballot entirely. I think that's a definite possibility. I definitely expect there to be fewer votes overall in that gubernatorial election. But I don't know that that necessarily translates to Stein pulling up Harris, so to speak.
Mm.
So, yeah, I think there are folks out there who will refuse to support Robinson. I think some of that undecided vote that we see in there, that's going to be non-voters on the gubernatorial ballot. So I do expect that Stein will outperform Robinson here. But whether that boosts Harris, I'm not sure. It doesn't hurt, that's for sure. But I expect there to be a pretty sizable difference between the presidential ballot and the gubernatorial ballot in North Carolina.
Interesting. So now looking at the Wisconsin Senate race, how do you interpret the tie between Hovde and Baldwin? And do you see any factors leading to a shift in support for either candidate at this point?
Not right now. These two races look very similar. I think that um, you know, overall, I would not want to be Hovde in this case. I think that we've seen this throughout the election that some of these Republican candidates can't perform as well as Trump at the top of the ticket. Whether or not that these voters again merely skip the Senate election or they vote Democrat, that kind of remains to be seen. But I would still handicap this race as a Democratic.
Okay, and lastly, Pennsylvania, Democrat Bob Casey has a slight 1% lead over Republican Dave McCormick, while Trump has a slight lead as well. And I don't know if you saw this, but earlier this week, Bob Casey even put out some ads showing that sometimes he sided with Trump during his presidency and is trying to pose himself as more an independent. So what does this tell us about down ballot Democrats trying to distance themselves from Kamala Harris?
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't say that it's the wrong tactic. Right now, we see Casey is winning independents. There is a higher undecided factor, though, for independents, about 15%. That's pretty high. Um, when we look at some of these other demographics, we see that folks who are under the age of 50, there's also a higher undecided rate there, about 9% overall. So, and that's a demographic that Casey otherwise wins. So I think that there is more upside here for Casey. I would rather be Casey in this case. I think that, we've seen him leading throughout the election cycle. So, I do think that this is also a Senate race that will tilt Democratic. This could be another case where we have split results between the presidential ballot and the Senate. But yeah, I think that these are all good signs for Casey. As long as turnout looks like 2020, I would rather be Casey than McCormick.
Mhm. So just to close it all out, how do you think that all of these states are informing demographically what we're going to see happen potentially nationally?
Ugh, that's a it's a big question,
Mhm.
Um, you know, these states are interesting. We do get to see, especially in North Carolina, I think we see a little bit more of a growing state, a state where demographics have shifted over the past 8 years, since 2016 and then since 2020. So, it is telling us something. It's certainly more competitive. We see younger voters migrating to the Democratic Party, coming back to where we expected them to be. But we also see that, some minority voters aren't necessarily supporting Democrats at the levels that they have in 2020 or in 2016 even. And, depending on turnout, that can be a major factor. It's going to be less important in states like Wisconsin, but it's going to be important in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And then looking at the other states, Georgia, especially very important, Arizona, Nevada, these are Sunbelt states, high growth and highly diverse. So, any sort of defection that Harris gets from some of these minority voters, that's really going to hurt her on election day. She cannot afford to lose these votes, even if she makes up a little bit in the white vote. But yeah, I think we're learning a lot here. I'm interested to see how some, as we continue to get folks who say that they have voted early. I'm interested to see how that breaks down. I think by later next week, we're going to have a good idea of where this race is headed.
Yeah, well, we're less than 2 weeks away from election day, and I know we're all looking forward to some much needed rest. But I'm wondering, I know it's so hard to keep all of these polls straight that you guys are coming up with new ones almost every single day. So what should we expect to see? Any more polls coming out in the next few days leading up to the election? And if so, what specific issues and demographics are you going to be focusing on?
Yeah, so we'll have a national poll out this Saturday. So you can watch our Twitter for that and wherever else it's released. Um, we're also going to have the swing states. We're going to be polling those again this next week for release sometime in between you know Thursday and Monday before the election. And we're also going to have a poll of Ohio that we're going to be taking a look at the presidential and the Senate election there. So we're going to be looking at all the same stuff again. I think that early vote number, that's going to be most interesting to me. I want to see how that breaks down, how it relates to 2020, and what that might say for election day. I think that's really going to inform us. We also, we're going to be looking at some of those votes. There are very few undecided voters still left here, but those who are tend to be younger. They tend to be more diverse. And in some cases, in some states, it tends to be women. Um, again, these are very small numbers of undecided voters, but that translates to thousands of votes in these states. So we will still be looking at that. We're going to be looking at it more sort of as a whole because we're going to have smaller sample sizes overall. But looking at that undecided vote as a whole, where it might be breaking, and folks who say that they've only recently made up their mind, or haven't made up their mind yet.
Well, I look forward to seeing those polls and having you back on to break them all down for us. Thank you so much for your time today, Matt.
Thank you.